The next verse begins with a reference to the previous verse. Probably best if you've had a look at it, but it's not essential. Verse 860. These two, like the sun, are always removed from effect and cause. Fire does not establish them, and the theorisers fail to understand. So these two, like the sun. It's not quite clear what these two are referring to. There's quite a lot in the previous verse which you could refer to, but I'm going to assume it refers to the last two things mentioned, which were non-ego and mentation. And non-ego and mentation are the two opposite poles of enlightenment practice. Non-ego is realization of the insubstantiality, not only of ourselves as an ego soul, but the insubstantiality of the physical world with which this apparent ego soul engages. So non-ego is one pole, and the other pole is mentation. This is when we're caught up in our thoughts, our ideas, our desires, our hatreds, and so on, and that's the basis with which we engage with the world of sensory perception. So that's the other pole of enlightenment practice. We could call that ignorance, and the non-ego pole, we could call that realization or enlightenment. And this is the dynamic that we're moving between, backwards and forwards all the time. It tends to be skewed in one particular direction, the direction of ignorance. But as enlightenment practitioners, we're working with this. We work on awakening more often, and we do this by being mindful of the attention, what the attention is doing, what direction it is attending to, because we have the choice. We can direct it to awareness, which is liberation, or we can direct it to what awareness is aware of. So these two, like the sun, are always removed from effect and cause. In other words, we have a free choice. This is our point of freedom. We can choose ignorance, or we can choose enlightenment. We're told that these two are like the sun, which is always removed from effect and cause. Why should the sun be removed from effect and cause? Well, a couple of verses back, fire was used as a metaphor for the ego. Fire is something which is released from a substance like wood, for example. And if we go back to the days when this text was written, it was quite difficult to produce fire. So you probably had flames that were kept going, and that was the easiest way to get fire, was to ignite it from another fire. And how else would you get fire? You'd get it from rubbing some flint together, rubbing some flint against another rock to create sparks perhaps, or you would light it from another fire. So that's the cause and effect of fire, through sparks created through a particular effort, or through ignition from another flame, another pre-existing flame. But the sun isn't ignited. The sun just appears. So it seems, when you consider it to other sources of fire, that it's not subject to cause and effect. So I think this is the understanding we can take here. The sun is not subject to effect and cause, and neither are realization and ignorance. They are two poles that we have a choice to move between. When we don't exercise that choice, we're in ignorance. When we exercise the choice, consciousness is once more liberated. Because it's not actually us that is getting liberated, or us that is ignorant. It's consciousness. Consciousness. We might like to think consciousness is absolute, stainless, pure, and that's actually true. But obviously, consciousness moves into ignorance, because that is our usual state. That is the way most of us are, in a state, most of the time, in a state of ignorance. So, that's the reality of consciousness. Consciousness falls asleep, but it can also awaken. In fact, it seems to have a bigger tendency to fall asleep than to awaken. And I wonder why that is. Why should consciousness be so asymmetrical, to prefer sleep to wakefulness? I think this is actually because of the strength of consciousness. It's because of consciousness's own power. Consciousness falls for its own delusion, and it falls for its own delusion because of the power of consciousness. The power of its delusion is so vast because consciousness is vast. Consciousness is all there is. Consciousness is omnipotent. So of course consciousness falls for its own delusion. Whatever consciousness is conscious of is its reality, is reality. We see this in our dreams. We're conscious of various entities, various things, various scenarios. It doesn't matter how ludicrous or absurd they are. We fall for them. We enter into them. This is the power of consciousness. Whatever we're attending to right now is reality. We might subsequently retract the reality status of what we were experiencing and say it was just a dream, it was just a story, it was just a movie. The assumption being, once again, that what we're experiencing right now is reality. What consciousness is conscious of is reality. So, I think that's why consciousness is deluded most of the time. It's because of the power of its own delusions. So these two, like the sun, these two poles of enlightenment practice, are always removed from effective cause. Fire does not establish them, and the theorisers fail to understand. Well, fire was used as a metaphor for the ego a couple of verses ago. Like the ego is somehow produced from the skandhas and so on. Somehow it's released from the skandhas as fire is released from wood. I think the point here, though, is that absolute freedom is not dependent on any conditions, nor is our ignorance. In fact, ignorance is normally listed as the first of the factors in the chain of conditioned co-production. It begins with ignorance. And there isn't any cause for ignorance. But ignorance is constantly being fueled and reinforced. So we don't need to set up any particular conditions. We don't need to move ourselves into any particular different space, any particular space, although it's sometimes worth experimenting if you feel you need to, but there's no need. We can come to realization right now. If you stop directing your attention to the screen and come back to a sense of your own being, perhaps close your eyes and feel the words where you are, not identifying them with a source external to you, because these words are happening where you are. So come back to where you are. Come back to your own sense of being. Come back to the awareness in which these words are happening. Direct the attention back to itself. And you come back to the equanimity of being. You come back to suchness. And in this suchness, we can enter in to the rainbow body and all the infinite potential that the different colours represent. This is something you can explore. You have the possibility of unconditional joy. You realize that joy need not be dependent on anything, just like your realization. It's a giddy possibility, a very giddy possibility. You might not be able to deal with that, but you can touch on it for the time being and explore it. We are ultimately free. Free to explore our relative divine nature. And this, the theorisers will fail to understand, because we've gone beyond their area of concern, which is one of meditation. I've been looking at a bit of philosophy recently once again, and some of that philosophy is to do with spirituality. It's quite interesting, but it's so far off the mark. Some interesting questions that are raised which are worth being addressed, but we don't need to spend too much time with that when we have this option of what I call exploring the rainbow body, when we realize that our enlightenment depends on nothing except the intention to observe the attention and then the intention not to fuel the projection of the attention, and to allow the attention to rest in itself, rest in the awareness which holds this universe. enjoy.